They never taught you this in school. They never mentioned it in the history books. The warriors who fought with tactics so psychologically devastating that the U.S. government locked the records away for 80 years weren't foreign operatives or enemy soldiers. They were Americans. Before we dive into what the military buried deep in classified vaults at Fort Huachuca, Andrews Air Force Base, and a National Archives facility in Kansas City, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. Then hit that subscribe button, because this channel depends on you to keep bringing these buried stories to light. The algorithm is already working against us. Your subscription is the only thing keeping these truths alive. 23 hours after Pearl Harbor turned the Pacific Fleet into burning wreckage, a telegram landed on the desk of the Tribal Council at the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. December 8, 1941. The paper looked standard, War Department letterhead, official stamps, but the words inside were anything but routine. It requested the immediate presence of tribal elders at Fort Huachuca for what it called a matter of national security and cultural preservation. By the time the sun dropped behind the Sonoran Peaks, 12 Apache elders had made the long desert journey to the installation. What happened in that room would never make it into any official war record. The conference room had no windows. A single bulb hung overhead, casting shadows that stretched long across concrete walls. Seated across from the elders were 3 men in Army uniforms, no name tags, no rank insignia, nothing to identify them. The oldest officer, a man the Apaches would later call only the Colonel, placed a leather folder on the table but never opened it. His hands didn't move. "Gentlemen," he began, and you could hear exhaustion in his voice, maybe fear. "We're about to ask you to help us win a war using methods that will never be acknowledged by this government or any other. What we discuss tonight is classified beyond even the Manhattan Project. If you agree to what we're proposing, you'll be training men to become something the world hasn't seen since your ancestors fought in these mountains. You'll be creating ghosts." The silence hung heavy in that room. Joseph Tyasotes, the tribal chairman, studied the colonel's face for what felt like minutes before he spoke. His answer, captured in a single declassified fragment that surfaced in 2014, was chilling. "Our grandfathers knew how to make an enemy fear the dark. If you want us to teach your soldiers that ancient art, you need to understand it comes with a price. Once a man learns to move like wind and kill like a mountain lion, he doesn't easily return to being a man who sleeps peacefully." This wasn't about code talkers. This was something else entirely. Something darker. The military wanted to weaponize ancient Apache guerrilla warfare. Psychological terror techniques passed down through oral tradition for generations, and merge them with modern combat training to create units that would operate in the deepest shadows of war. The program never received an official name in any documentation that's been discovered. Researchers who've spent decades piecing together fragments from scattered sources call it simply the Shadow War Initiative. By January 1942, the first volunteers arrived at a newly built facility 30 miles northeast of Fort Huachuca, hidden in a box canyon that had once been Apache hunting grounds. The military chose that location deliberately. They wanted the men to feel their ancestors, to tap into something primal that couldn't be taught in regular boot camps. 147 men reported for training. Only 63 completed it. The others simply vanished from all military records. Their families received telegrams saying they'd been transferred to classified assignments. No further information was ever provided. No bodies, no answers. The training that unfolded in that canyon over 6 brutal months has been described in fragmented testimonies and partially redacted documents as beyond anything the military had attempted before or since. The men learned to move through terrain without disturbing a single blade of grass, to navigate by stars and scent, to survive for weeks behind enemy lines without supplies, and perhaps most disturbing, to inflict psychological terror that would shatter an enemy's will long before any physical confrontation became necessary. A journal entry from Lieutenant Robert Chun, one of only 3 non-Apache officers permitted to observe the training, was discovered in his personal effects after his death in 1998. The entry, dated March 14, 1942, reads like something out of a nightmare. Today I watched something that made me question whether we're the good guys in this war. The instructors demonstrated what they call the fear walk. It involves stalking an enemy position for hours, leaving signs that you're there but never revealing yourself. You move objects slightly. You leave marks that suggest something inhuman has passed through. You create sounds the human brain can't quite identify. By the time you actually engage, the enemy is already psychologically defeated. They're fighting ghosts, and ghosts can't be killed. I asked Sergeant Chino if he worried about what happens to our men when they return home after learning these techniques. He looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his 24 years and said, "They won't all return. And the ones who do won't be the same men who left." I'm beginning to understand what he meant. The first deployment came in June 1942. 12 men were inserted into the Philippines, tasked with operating behind Japanese lines in the dense jungles of Mindanao. Their official mission was intelligence gathering. The reality was something entirely different. They were conducting what modern military analysts would call hyper-aggressive psychological operations combined with targeted assassinations, designed to create maximum terror with minimum engagement. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji, a Japanese officer whose diary was recovered after the war and translated by American intelligence, described encounters with what he believed were supernatural forces. His entry from August 3, 1942, describes an incident that left 20 of his men dead without a single shot being fired. We found Sergeant Nakamura hanging from a tree at dawn. His throat had been cut, but there was no blood on the ground beneath him. Around the tree were markings we couldn't identify, symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. That night we heard sounds in the jungle, not animal, not human, something else. By morning, 6 more men were dead, each killed in their sleep, their eyes wide open as if they'd seen something that stopped their hearts. We found no footprints, no disturbances, nothing to indicate any human had been in our camp. My commanding officer has ordered us to abandon this position. The men are terrified. They speak of demons. I don't know what's hunting us, but it's winning. What Yamamoto didn't know, and what wouldn't be revealed until documents were partially declassified in 2006, was that only 2 Apache soldiers had been responsible for the deaths of those Japanese troops and the psychological collapse of an entire battalion. The techniques they used were never officially documented, but fragments suggest they combined traditional Apache stealth with newly developed chemical compounds designed to produce hallucinogenic effects when absorbed through the skin, along with acoustic devices that generated subsonic frequencies known to induce extreme anxiety and paranoia. Back at the Arizona training facility, a second wave of recruits was undergoing even more intensive preparation. The military had learned from the first deployment that Apache methods were extraordinarily effective, and they wanted to expand the program. By late 1942, the facility housed over 300 trainees and instructors. It had also acquired a disturbing reputation among regular military personnel stationed at Fort Huachuca. Soldiers reported seeing lights in the canyon at strange hours, hearing sounds that made no sense, encountering men from the facility who moved and spoke in ways that seemed fundamentally wrong. A report filed by Captain James Morrison, the base psychiatrist, in November 1942 raised concerns that were immediately classified and buried. I've now examined 17 men who've had contact with personnel from the canyon facility. All described similar symptoms: persistent nightmares, a sense of being watched constantly, an inability to feel safe even in locked rooms with armed guards posted. 3 have requested transfer to combat units, stating they'd rather face the enemy than remain on a base with what one corporal described as men who've stopped being men. I attempted to visit the facility to assess the mental health of the trainees, but my request was denied by command I cannot identify. I'm deeply concerned about what's being created in that canyon, and what will happen when these individuals are deployed into combat situations where there's no oversight or accountability. The concerns were warranted. Between 1942 and 1945, Apache shadow units deployed to every major theater of war: Italy, France, Germany, throughout the Pacific Islands, China. Their operations were never coordinated with regular military command. They received orders through a separate chain that reported directly to a classified office in the War Department that officially didn't exist. When conventional units encountered evidence of their operations, they were given cover stories involving special forces, local resistance fighters, or unexplained enemy casualties. In the Ardennes Forest during the Battle of the Bulge, a German battalion reported being systematically destroyed by what they described as ghost soldiers. A letter from Oberleutnant Hans Richter to his wife, intercepted by Allied intelligence, described his unit's final days. "Marta, I don't think I'll see you again. We're being hunted by something that defies explanation. Every night more men disappear. We find them days later, if we find them at all, always in places that should have been impossible to reach without us seeing or hearing. The Americans have unleashed something from the old world, something that remembers when warfare was about breaking the spirit before breaking the body. Our officers tell us to hold the line, but there is no line. There's only the forest and the things that move within it. Last night I saw one of them, just a glimpse in the moonlight. He was covered in markings, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's eyes. He looked at me, and I felt my courage drain away. I know now why our men are deserting. It's not cowardice. It's survival instinct. Some things aren't meant to be fought." The German unit surrendered 3 days later, the first time in the war an entire Wehrmacht battalion had surrendered without engaging in direct combat. When questioned by American intelligence officers, the German soldiers all told similar stories of supernatural encounters, psychological torture, an enemy that seemed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The intelligence reports were immediately classified and removed from normal documentation chains. In the Pacific, operations grew even more extreme. On Okinawa, Japanese defenders began reporting attacks by what they called the silent ones, enemy combatants who never spoke, never revealed themselves fully, seemed capable of infiltrating the most secure positions without triggering alarms or encountering resistance. A report from Japanese High Command, discovered after the war in bunker ruins, described an incident where an entire command post was found with all personnel dead, bodies showing no signs of struggle or external wounds. Medical examinations suggested they died from what modern forensics would identify as extreme stress-induced cardiac events, all in the same night, all at approximately the same time. An American Marine Corps after-action report from May 1945, partially declassified in 2009, described encountering the aftermath of what was clearly an Apache shadow unit operation. "We advanced into the cave system expecting heavy resistance, based on intelligence suggesting it was a major Japanese supply depot and command center. Instead, we found approximately 80 enemy combatants, all dead. The scene was unlike anything I've witnessed in 3 years of combat. The bodies were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to create maximum psychological impact. Some were positioned to appear as if they were still alive, watching the entrance. Others had been moved to impossible locations. The entire complex smelled of something I can't identify, something that made us all intensely uneasy. My men refused to remain in the caves. Several became physically ill. We marked the location and withdrew. I recommend this site be sealed and avoided. Whatever happened here went beyond conventional warfare. By spring 1945, as the war in Europe ended and the Pacific Campaign intensified, the Apache Shadow units had compiled a combat record that was simultaneously impressive and deeply disturbing. They'd conducted over 200 documented operations, though many believe the actual number was significantly higher. Their confirmed kill count exceeded 3,000 enemy combatants, but more significantly, they'd broken the morale of countless enemy units, caused mass desertions, created a psychological weapon that may have shortened the war by months. But there was a cost the military hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared to handle. The men who'd been transformed into shadow warriors weren't easily transforming back into ordinary soldiers or civilians. Reports filtered back from the Pacific in the war's final months, describing incidents where Apache unit members had become unresponsive to commands, had attacked friendly forces who startled them, or had simply vanished into the jungle and never returned. A classified medical report from a field hospital in the Philippines, dated July 1945, described treating 3 soldiers from an Apache Shadow unit who'd been found wandering in a state the doctors called combat psychosis unlike any previously documented. These men don't respond to normal psychiatric interventions. They speak in languages that don't match any known Apache dialect. They demonstrate physical abilities that seem enhanced beyond normal human capacity. When sedated, they exhibit REM sleep patterns associated with extreme trauma. But when conscious, they show no obvious signs of distress. It's as if they exist in a state between full consciousness and some other mode of being. I've recommended they be transferred to specialized care, but my requests have been denied. I was informed by a colonel whose name I was instructed not to record that these men are to be kept isolated and that under no circumstances should their condition be documented in official medical records. As the war ended and massive demobilization began, the military faced a critical problem. They'd created highly trained killers who'd been conditioned to operate outside all normal rules of warfare, who'd been psychologically altered to embrace methods that violated every convention of civilized combat, and who now needed to be reintegrated into peacetime society. The solution they arrived at was as cold as it was pragmatic. They simply made most of the Apache Shadow Warriors disappear from official records. Of the 237 men who completed Shadow Warrior training between 1942 and 1945, only 68 appear in any post-war military records. The others vanish from all documentation after their last deployment. Their families were told they died in combat, but no bodies were ever returned, no graves were ever marked. No names appeared on memorials. They became ghosts in death as they'd been in war. The few who did officially return were sent to a facility that appears in no official documentation but is referenced obliquely in several declassified memos from the late 1940s, located somewhere in the mountains of New Mexico. This facility was described as a rehabilitation center for special operations personnel. Letters that survived from men sent there paint a different picture. One letter from a soldier named Thomas Naich to his brother, dated October 6, 1946, was discovered decades later in family papers. They tell us we're being helped, but this place is a prison. They keep us isolated from each other. They give us medications that make it hard to think clearly. They ask us questions about what we did during the war, but when we answer honestly, they become frightened. I think they're trying to make us forget, but you can't forget what you've become. The training changed something fundamental. We learned to tap into aspects of our heritage that were meant to remain buried. We learned to become what our ancestors warned against becoming, and now they want to erase what they created. I don't think many of us will leave this place. If you receive notice that I've died, don't believe it. We don't die easy. Not anymore. Thomas Notch's official death certificate, dated November 3, 1946, states he died of pneumonia at a veterans hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico. No hospital records confirm his presence at any facility in Albuquerque. His body was never returned to his family. He was 26 years old. The disappearances didn't end with the war's conclusion. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a disturbing pattern emerged across the southwestern United States. Apache men, many too young to have served in World War II, began vanishing from reservations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Tribal police reports filed during this period describe a consistent scenario. The men would receive visits from individuals claiming to be military recruiters or government officials. They'd be told about special opportunities, classified programs, ways to serve their country in ways that would honor their heritage. Then they'd disappear. A report filed by Officer Daniel Beatty of the San Carlos Apache Tribal Police in April 1952 describes one such case. On the morning of April 9th, I was called to the home of Margaret Goshen, who reported that her son Michael, age 23, had left 3 days prior with 2 men in a black sedan bearing government plates. She said the men told Michael he'd been selected for a special program based on his family lineage. They mentioned his grandfather by name, Joseph Goshen, who served in World War II in a classified capacity. Margaret hasn't heard from Michael since. When I attempted to contact the military liaison office at Fort Huachuca, I was told no such recruitment had taken place and that I shouldn't pursue the matter further. I was also advised, in terms that seemed threatening, that continuing to investigate would be detrimental to both my career and the well-being of the reservation community. What the tribal police didn't know, and what wouldn't become clear for decades, was that the Shadow Warrior program had never actually ended. It had simply gone deeper underground. The onset of the Cold War created new demands for the type of operatives the Apache program had produced. The military and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency recognized that in a world of nuclear standoffs and proxy wars, the ability to conduct operations that left no fingerprints and created maximum psychological impact was more valuable than ever. A series of documents declassified inadvertently in 2017 revealed that between 1948 and 1963, a continuation program operating under the code name Night Wind recruited and trained over 100 additional Apache operatives. These men were deployed to Korea, Vietnam, Guatemala, Iran, and numerous other locations where the United States conducted covert operations. Unlike their World War II predecessors, these operatives never officially existed. No military records, no service numbers, no documentation of any kind. In Korea, stories emerged among both American and enemy forces of something moving through the mountains that seemed more spirit than soldier. A Marine Corps intelligence report from December 1950, recently discovered in misfiled documents at Camp Pendleton, describes an interrogation of a captured Chinese officer who'd been found wandering alone, separated from his unit. The officer, speaking through a translator, described encountering what he called the wind that kills. According to the report, the prisoner became extremely agitated when questioned about his unit's disappearance. He insisted they'd been attacked by forces that couldn't be seen, that left no trace except the bodies of his comrades. He claimed these forces used weapons that made no sound, that killed without wounds, that seemed to appear and disappear at will. He repeatedly stated he'd seen one of these attackers, described as having markings on his face that glowed in darkness and eyes that looked through him rather than at him. The prisoner refused to provide further information and became catatonic. He died 3 days later from what medical personnel determined to be acute cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological trauma. No physical cause of death could be established. In Vietnam, the pattern continued and intensified. Between 1964 and 1973, reports filtered back through various channels of American Special Forces operatives who seemed to operate under no known command structure, who used methods that shocked even hardened combat veterans, who appeared to be employing techniques combining modern technology with something far more ancient and primal. A memoir published in 1998 by former Green Beret officer Captain Raymond Teller describes an encounter in the Central Highlands in 1967 that he'd kept secret for 3 decades. We were conducting a reconnaissance patrol when we came across what appeared to be the aftermath of a battle. An entire Viet Cong company, approximately 120 men, lay dead in the clearing, but there'd been no battle. No bullet casings. No explosion craters. No signs of combat whatsoever. The bodies showed various causes of death, but what struck me most was their expressions. Every single one looked absolutely terrified. Eyes wide open. Faces frozen in expressions of pure horror. Some had apparently died trying to run. Others seemed to have killed themselves. We found 3 who'd shot themselves in the head, apparently preferring that to facing whatever they'd encountered. As we were examining the scene, one of my sergeants called me over to the tree line. There, carved into a large mahogany tree, were symbols I didn't recognize, some kind of warning or marker. My Montagnard guide took one look at them and refused to go further. He said those marks belonged to the shadow hunters and that we needed to leave immediately. As we were evacuating the area, I saw movement in the jungle canopy. Just for a moment, I saw a figure painted in patterns that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was watching us, making sure we left. I never filed an official report about what we saw that day. I knew it would be classified or dismissed. But I've thought about it every day. Since, the technology being employed by these operatives had evolved significantly since World War II, Declassified. Research documents from the Army's Chemical and Biological Warfare Division reveal that throughout the 1950s and 60s, extensive research was conducted into compounds that could induce extreme fear, paranoia, and psychological breakdown. One research summary from 1961, stamped with the highest classification levels, describes testing of a compound referred to only as whisper agent. According to the document, the agent demonstrates remarkable effectiveness in inducing acute anxiety and auditory hallucinations in test subjects. When deployed in microdoses through dermal absorption or inhalation, subjects report hearing voices, experiencing visual distortions, developing intense paranoia regarding their immediate surroundings. Effects can persist for 72 hours or longer. Combined with environmental stressors and isolation, the agent can produce complete psychological collapse in previously stable individuals. Recommended for deployment in specialized psychological operations where plausible deniability regarding chemical agent use must be maintained. The research wasn't limited to chemical agents. Another document from 1964 details acoustic weapons designed to produce subsonic and ultrasonic frequencies that could induce disorientation, nausea, and in some cases cardiac events in target populations. These devices were small enough to be carried by individual operatives and could be deployed without creating obvious evidence of their use. A field report from Vietnam in 1968 describes the deployment of what was coded as Nightbird technology by unidentified special operations personnel. Following deployment, enemy forces in the target area exhibited signs of mass hysteria. Radio intercepts indicated they believed they were being attacked by supernatural forces. Multiple enemy combatants were observed fleeing into the jungle without their weapons. Several were recovered days later in states of extreme psychological distress, reporting experiences that matched symptoms associated with Nightbird exposure. The operation achieved its objectives without a single round being fired. But the most disturbing revelations about the program came not from official documents, but from the men who'd been recruited and somehow survived to tell their stories. In 2004, a former operative using the pseudonym David Nighthorse contacted a journalist with a story he said he could no longer keep silent. The resulting article was published in a small independent outlet and was quickly scrubbed from the internet. Only a few copies survived. In it, Nighthorse described being recruited in 1970 at age 19 from the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. "They told me I'd been chosen because of my bloodline," Nighthorse stated. "They said my great-grandfather had been one of the original warriors and that I carried something in my blood that made me suitable for the program. They took me to a facility I can't locate on any map. It was underground, carved into a mountain somewhere in the Four Corners region. The training was unlike anything you can imagine. They didn't just teach us how to fight or survive. They taught us how to tap into something they called ancestral memory. They used drugs, sensory deprivation, extreme stress, and techniques I still don't fully understand to break down our normal consciousness and rebuild it into something else. They taught us to move through the world as if we weren't fully part of it, to become observers and actors simultaneously, to see patterns normal people can't see, to influence others through presence alone. By the time the training was complete, I wasn't the same person who'd entered that facility. None of us were." Nighthorse described being deployed multiple times between 1971 and 1976 to locations he was forbidden from identifying. "We'd be inserted into hostile territories with objectives that were never fully explained. Sometimes we were told to eliminate specific targets. Other times we were simply told to create chaos and fear. We used every technique we'd been taught, both the traditional Apache methods and the modern technologies they developed. We were extraordinarily effective, but there was a cost. Every operation took something from us, made us less human, more like the ghosts we pretended to be. Several of my teammates simply walked away one day, disappeared into the wilderness, were never seen again. Others had psychological breaks and had to be institutionalized. The ones who survived often couldn't reintegrate into normal life. We'd been changed at a fundamental level." The journalist who published Nighthorse's story, Michael Torres, attempted to verify the claims and quickly found himself facing obstacles at every turn. When he tried to file Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the program, he was told no such program existed. When he attempted to interview other potential operatives, he found that most were deceased, often under mysterious circumstances. When he tried to locate the facilities Nighthorse described, he encountered military installations that officially served entirely different purposes, and access was completely restricted. Torres published 2 follow-up articles, before abruptly ceasing all investigation in 2006. In his final piece, he wrote, "I've been advised by sources I consider credible that continuing this investigation poses risks to both my safety and that of my family. I've been told in clear terms that certain subjects aren't meant to be explored by civilian journalists. I've been shown evidence that others who pursued similar lines of inquiry have experienced significant negative consequences. I'm therefore ending my investigation into this matter. However, I want to state clearly that I believe the core elements of what David Nighthorse described are true. I believe our government created and deployed operatives who were trained to use psychological warfare techniques that went far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. I believe these programs may still be operational in some form. And I believe the men who served in these capacities deserve recognition for their sacrifices, even if that recognition can never be public." Torres died in 2009 in what was ruled a hiking accident in the mountains near Taos, New Mexico. His research materials were never recovered. David Nighthorse hasn't been heard from since. 2005, the most recent evidence of the program's continued existence, emerged in 2019 when a Defense Department budget document was accidentally released in unredacted form before being quickly recalled. Buried in hundreds of pages of line items was a single entry: Heritage Warrior Continuation, Fiscal Year 2020, $12.3 million. The entry provided no additional details about what the program entailed or where it was based. Follow-up inquiries by congressional oversight committees were met with responses stating the entry was related to Native American cultural preservation programs at military installations. No further information has been released, but there are signs the legacy of the Shadow Warrior program extends beyond any official continuation. Throughout the past 2 decades, there have been persistent reports from conflict zones around the world of encounters with forces that employ tactics remarkably similar to those used by the Apache operatives. In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters reported being terrorized by what they called the Silent Death that moved through the mountains and killed without sound or trace. In Syria, both ISIS and government forces encountered what they described as phantom units that seemed to appear and disappear at will. Using methods combining high technology with psychological warfare techniques that seem to draw on ancient traditions. Intelligence analysts who've studied these reports, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggest the techniques pioneered by the Apache Shadow Warrior program have been adopted and adapted by multiple military and intelligence services around the world. The fundamental insight of that program, one analyst explained, was that the most effective warfare operates on the psychological level before it operates on the physical level. If you can break an enemy's will, if you can make them afraid of the dark, afraid of silence, afraid of their own shadows, you've already won. What the Apaches understood, and what the military learned from them, was that this kind of warfare isn't just about tactics. It's about tapping into primal human fears that exist below conscious thought. Once you learn how to weaponize those fears, you've created something that can never be fully defended against. The reservations where the original operatives were recruited from have become places of deep collective trauma. Elders speak in hushed tones about the men who went away and the ones who came back changed. There are stories passed down but never officially recorded of veterans who returned from the program unable to sleep indoors, who spoke languages no one recognized, who seemed to exist partially in this world and partially in another. Some communities held ceremonies to try to cleanse these men of what had been done to them, but the results were mixed at best. A medicine man from the San Carlos Reservation, speaking in 2012 on condition of anonymity, described the challenge. The old ways can heal many things. They can restore balance when balance has been disturbed. But what was done to these men went beyond disturbance. It was a fundamental alteration of who they were. The military took our warriors and turned them into something that neither fully belongs to the human world nor fully to the spirit world. They created beings that exist in between. Some of those men are still out there, living in the remote places, unable to return to normal life. We leave food for them sometimes at the old places. It's gone by morning, but we never see who takes it. The families of the men who disappeared into the program carry their own burdens. They live with the knowledge that their loved ones served their country in ways that will never be acknowledged, using methods that can't be discussed, paying prices that can't be calculated. Some families still hope for answers. Others have given up hoping and simply try to remember the men their fathers, brothers, and sons were before they were taken. In the National Archives, in the classified sections that require the highest level security clearance to access, there are reportedly entire filing cabinets devoted to the Shadow Warrior program and its various iterations. These files contain operational reports, training documents, medical records, and psychological evaluations that paint a picture of one of the most extreme military experiments in American history. They also contain letters, personal effects, and photographs of the men who participated, men who in many cases have no other record of existence, men who became ghosts by design and remained ghosts by necessity. The question that haunts researchers who've tried to piece together this history isn't whether the program was effective. All available evidence suggests it was extraordinarily effective. The question is what we created in the process and whether it can ever be unmade. The men who went through that training were altered at levels that may not be fully reversible. They were taught to access parts of human consciousness most people never encounter. They were given tools, both technological and psychological, that gave them capabilities that seemed to border on the supernatural. And then they were deployed into situations where those capabilities weren't just permitted but encouraged. Some of those men are still alive. They live in the margins of society, in remote locations, under assumed names. They're men in their 80s and 90s now, but according to those who've encountered them, they remain formidable and deeply unsettling. They move differently. They perceive things others don't. They exist in a state of constant readiness that never fully disengages. The war ended for most soldiers in 1945 or 1973, or whenever their service concluded. For the Shadow Warriors, the war never ended. It simply changed theaters. The enemy changed faces, but the fundamental nature of what they are remained constant. And there's evidence, troubling and persistent, that new recruits are still being trained. That somewhere in the desert Southwest, or perhaps in multiple locations, young Apache men are still being approached with promises of serving their country in special ways. That the techniques and knowledge developed over decades of classified operations are being refined and passed forward to new generations. The program that officially doesn't exist continues to not exist, but its effects ripple outward through time, creating warriors who will never be honored, battles that will never be recorded, victories that will never be celebrated. If you've followed this story to its conclusion, you now carry knowledge that's been deliberately kept from the public for 8 decades. You know about a program that turned men into weapons of psychological warfare. You know about operations that violated every convention of civilized combat. You know about the costs paid by individuals, families, and entire communities so that wars could be won through methods that could never be acknowledged. This knowledge comes with a responsibility. The responsibility to remember what was done, to honor those who sacrificed, even when their sacrifice can't be publicly recognized, and to ask difficult questions about what we're willing to do in the name of national security. But beyond the history and the horror and the hidden truths, there's a deeper message here. The Shadow Warrior program succeeded because it tapped into darkness, because it embraced methods that dehumanized both the enemy and those who employed them. It created victories through fear and psychological destruction. It was effective, but it wasn't righteous. As you reflect on this story, I want to encourage you to turn toward the light rather than the darkness, to seek truth in the teachings of Jesus Christ, who showed us that real strength comes not from inspiring fear, but from embodying love. That true victory isn't found in breaking others, but in lifting them up. In a world that continues to embrace shadows, choose to follow the one who said, "I am the light of the world." The men in this story were asked to become darkness. You have the choice to become something better. The files remain sealed. The programs continue. The ghosts still walk, but whether they walk into the light or remain in shadow is a question that remains unanswered, waiting in the classified darkness of government vaults and the silent memories of warriors who can never fully return home.